Welcome to another episode of What Happens in Jane Austen's Novels but by Month. Welcome to May.
Pride and Prejudice. Maria Gardiner is elated at being a guest at Lady Catherine's. "We have dined 9 times at Rosings, beside drinking tea there twice. How much I shall have to tell," she says. At the last dinner at Rosings, Lady Catherine tries to get Lizzie to stay longer. Lizzie explains that her father needs her at home. Lady Catherine typically replies, "Oh, your father of course may spare you if your mother can. Daughters are never of so much consequence to a father." Lizzie comes to understand Charlotte is content in her life with Mr. Collins and that she manages him well. Mr. Darcy gives Lizzie the explanation letter regarding his past history with Mr. Wickham, uncovering the latter's devious nature and deliberate attempt to seduce Georgiana. Darcy also admits to persuading Mr. Bingley that Jane Bennet was not in love with Bingley and that he should move on. We are disappointed to learn that Mr. Bingley can be so easily swayed by his friend.
Upon reading the letter from Mr. Darcy, Lizzie is aghast. This must be false, this cannot be, this must be the grossest falsehood. But after contemplating the letter during a 2-hour walk, Lizzie realises she had misjudged Mr. Darcy in the most part, regarding his behaviour of Mr. Wickham. But she is infuriated and hurt at Darcy's assumptions regarding Jane's feelings for Mr. Bingley, and appalled that he deliberately withheld from Bingley Jane's presence in Bath. In the second week of May, Lizzie and Maria leave the Collins at Hunsford and travel to Gracechurch Street to the Gardeners to collect Jane. They break at the George Inn for lunch, where they meet up with Lydia and Kitty with Mr. Bennet's carriage for the onward journey. "And we mean to treat you all to lunch," added Lydia. "But you must lend us the money, for we have just spent ours at the shop out there." They all stay for a few days with the Gardeners before heading back to Longbourn. It is here that Lydia announces that Mr. Wickham is not to marry Miss King. I think it is interesting at this point Lydia seems not to express any particular romantic interest in Mr. Wickham. Lizzie is bursting to tell Jane about Mr. Darcy's proposal in April and his letter condemning Mr. Wickham, but she keeps to herself Darcy's involvement with removing Bingley from Jane. She feels guilty about doing this but doesn't want to further hurt her dearest sister. The third week of May was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, so Lydia and Kitty in particular were out of sorts. The subject of the Brighton trip with Mrs. Forster came up again, and Mr. Bennet was eventually worn down and agreed to Lydia going to Brighton. Lizzie was appalled and unsuccessfully tried to convince Mr. Bennet to retract his agreement. Mr. Bennet seemed to think it's all a bit of a joke and that Lydia will ultimately make a fool of herself wherever she goes. Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances. Just before the regiment leaves, Lizzie has to prepare herself for meeting Mr. Wickham, now she knows the truth about him. Wickham and some other officers are invited to Longbourn to dine. Wickham is alarmed upon hearing that Lizzie spent a great deal of social time with Mr. Darcy and is disturbed by her ambiguous comment. "When I said that Mr. Darcy improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that his mind or his manners were in a state of improvement, but that, from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood." Lizzie refuses to be drawn into Wickham's attempt to retrieve old grievances, but it's clear that Wickham realises that Lizzie now knows the truth about him.
Emma. Mrs. Churchill is due to visit London, so Mr. Weston and the Eltons are eagerly expecting visits from Frank Churchill. Upon first meeting Frank Churchill at the ball, Emma found him agreeable, although a little forward, but decided that she could fancy such a man. Frank Churchill spends a great deal of time with Emma at the ball and is openly flirtatious. They both engage in people-watching and making fun of some of the guests. Mr. and Mrs. Elton appeared at the ball, and Mr. Weston was shocked to discover they had forgotten to pick up Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax, and he sent the carriage off directly to correct the mistake. Mr. Weston's sense of propriety is very clear here. Emma declares to Mr. Knightley that she would dance with him if he should ask her, as they are not so very much brother and sister. Here begins Emma's realisation that she feels more for Mr. Knightley than mere friendship. Harriet was frightened by the gypsy children and was rescued by Frank Churchill, upon whom she developed a crush. Her fickleness of heart in romantic attachments illustrates her deep need to find love and acceptance for herself. Mansfield Park. Fanny is without a horse and has to spend most of her time walking. The Miss Bertrams rode every day, leaving no available horse for Fanny. But Lady Bertram thinks exercise is unnecessary and therefore makes no attempt to find Fanny a replacement horse. So Fanny is left to her own devices and is largely ignored by everyone. Upon Edmund's return, he was shocked that Fanny's needs had been neglected and sought out a horse for her. What a considerate chap.
We hope you enjoyed this May video. Northanger Abbey, Persuasion and Sense and Sensibility don't actually mention anything occurring in May. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching and check us out on Etsy for Jane Austen inspired gifts and letters.